So welcome back to Sick Society. It's so great to have you back with us. As always, I'm joined again today by my co-host, Goddard. And today what we're going to tackle is we're going to try and understand why housing is so important to health. You know, there's a real stereotype that British houses are old and they're cold and they're damp. And I gotta be honest, that's not far off from the truth. And what's really interesting is that even in 2025, over 3 million people in Britain cannot afford to heat their homes enough to actually keep themselves warm. And while this might seem like a policy issue for how British people build their homes, and you might be wondering why we're going to talk about this, but housing is also intimately related to health. You know, poor quality cold and damp housing, it has direct influence on health. It causes illnesses like respiratory conditions. It worsens existing medical conditions, so it actually makes things like high blood pressure and heart disease worse. And of course, beyond the physical, living in cold, often unaffordable or insecure housing, it has real mental impact. It causes chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. And we know that people who live in the opposite of that, who live in warm, stable, secure housing, well, it should be no surprise that, of course, they have better health. They recover from illness more completely, and they actually do better in education and employment. So it does seem like a bit of a simple fix, right? So what is standing in our way to creating warmer, safer homes? Well, to help us answer that question, we're joined today by social policy journalist Hannah Fearn. And it's great to have her here because Hannah is an experienced journalist, columnist, and editor. She specializes in social affairs, but she has a particular interest in housing. And Hannah has been comment editor of The Independent. She's been a journalist with The Guardian, Times Higher Education, Inside Housing. She writes for the Financial Times, The Independent on Sunday, The Eye, Perspective, New Statesman, and I could go on. So let's get this going and hear from Hannah about what's really going on. Hannah, welcome.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
So I'm Hannah Fearn. I'm a social affairs journalist. I've been covering housing and health policy for 20 years now, and I regularly unpick some of these deep policy issues and try and do it in a way that's digestible for your ordinary audience who wouldn't spend their weekend reading a 450-page policy document. So that's my service. That's the one I provide.
That's an excellent service. We thank you for your service.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping that we might try and get a bit more understanding about some of the more subtle effects of where we live and how we live on our health. I think it's a no-brainer. People know that it's really, really hot, get heat stroke, and when it's really, really cold, you can become unwell because of that. And clearly we see that in the NHS in the UK with our winter crises every year with monotonous predictability. But cold has an insidious effect on our health and our biology. So, it might be fun to explore a bit of that as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I thought it might be worth us just going over what does that mean for us? What does that actually mean for someone living in a cold home for their health? We know that if they lived in a warmer home or in the summer, a cooler home, that they would probably live healthier lives. But what does it actually do to someone to live in a cold home?
Well, I think anybody who's been cold and not wanted to be cold knows how uncomfortable it feels. And there are clear physiological changes as we get colder. And I read somewhere relatively recently that the tipping point is about 18 degrees centigrade. And at that point, your body starts to do all the protective mechanisms that it needs to get warmth going to the important organs like your brain and your heart. So what that means is you then end up with cold extremities. It tends to mean that your blood vessels get a bit more squeezed, so that puts your blood pressure up. It also increases your risk of getting clots and heart problems. So there are direct causes. We know that when the weather gets colder, we see more people coming in with heart attacks, more people coming in with strokes. But also the whole thing of when people are cold, they gather together. That improves communication of diseases amongst ourselves. And when you're cold, you're less able to fight off disease. So not only is your exposure risk increased, but you are less able to cope with it. So I think we understand quite a lot about the physiology behind what happens when we get cold. And if you add in dampness to that as well, because the wonder of damp conditions is that it allows all sorts of other organisms like fungi and spores to start spreading around, which can cause all sorts of problems with your lungs. And we've seen that particularly in children. But also, if a young expectant mum is exposed to poor air in that setting, that will have a direct impact on the fetus and have long-term implications for the whole of that child and then adult's life. But we don't ever think about it of thinking, okay, well, let's make sure we keep everybody warm above 18 degrees centigrade. I don't think any policy has ever been designed to do that. But perhaps we do need to think a bit more about it. It's interesting that countries like Canada that are focused on housing for homelessness have shown that it makes a dramatic improvement in the health of homeless people. So we know it works, but it's then having the political will to do that and take money from somewhere else when you've got limited resources.
This is the hardest question for politicians across these issues, is that we know that intervening early on saves huge amounts of money long term, but then the immediate cost can be painful for taxpayers. So that you're referring, I think, to the housing first policy in Canada, and that's been hugely successful in preventing homelessness, like long-term homelessness, as well as stopping a kind of a cycle of homelessness, which you often see with people returning to street homelessness. And that's because it puts the immediate need first. So we'll provide you with a house, and then whatever psychological support, health support you need as a wraparound to that, we'll give you after we've given you the house. And it's usually, in most countries, it's the other way around, although the Canadian model is now starting to be seen as an exemplar. So fingers crossed we see more of it here. It's used in some cities here now. But that's the same with all of these policies. It would be the same with health interventions and so on. It's just so costly up front.
It's interesting. We know exactly what we need to do. We know exactly how that will help.
Mm.
We know that it'll cost us a heck of a lot less in the long run.
Mm.
But we just can't get over the line.
We have a political barrier, which is that a lot of people don't want to pay for other people's problems because they don't see it as their problem, when in fact all of society is affected by the health of the community more broadly, and our growth is affected by that in so many ways. I mean, we do a whole other podcast on that, but that's the problem, is that selling this costly answer to a relatively feeling impoverished population, which at the moment that's an acute issue. People's wages are going up very slowly, but much less than inflation. Everybody's really worried about the cost of bills. Council taxes really upset people, and that's going to literally looking after their elderly. So it's very difficult to sell it.
So we almost need a shift in the zeitgeist. Like, people need to take a more community approach to understanding how we live together and what that means for the decisions government will make and the money they'll spend.
I think the reason that you've seen the Green Party do so well in recent months, relatively, is to do with the fact that they are talking about that ethos. And actually the Lib Dems too. Ed Davey he's obviously got family experience of being a carer and so on. He's talked about how care work fits into society and talked about more of a communal approach to the big questions of our time. And he's also doing quite well. So it's interesting to see that does seem to be picking up some traction. But as we talked about before, it's not the dominant narrative at the moment.
And a recurrent theme that we've got is that policies need to be long-term rather than short-term. And we live in a world where we live on a 4 or 5 year political cycle, which just doesn't help any of these issues get
It doesn't
solved.
help, but it's also better than the alternative when you look at America right now.
Well, yeah, at least we're not actively unpicking what's happened in the last 4 years. Well, yeah, as I say to my students, this will definitely be on the exam, but policy seems to be one of the key aspects of health, actually. It'll be the recurring theme, I think, of this podcast, regardless of what series we find ourselves in, because we just keep coming back to how if we can change those policies, then we can actually live healthier, happier lives. But we have to have a will to change that policy. Yeah. I did a little digging to see, obviously Britain's not the only place that has a cold winter. And I thought it would be interesting to see, what is it like in other countries? Do they have the same kind of issues with that direct relationship of living in a cold home? And it would seem a bit of a no-brainer to go and look at things like the Scandinavian countries and Germany and France and things like that also have similarly cold areas. And what I found was that they don't have the same levels of death due to living in the cold that we do here.
That's right. We do particularly badly, and it is because of the quality of our housing stock. We have among the oldest housing stock actually in the world, but particularly in Europe. We have not redeveloped in the same way that other countries. Other countries have been much more ambitious about demolishing old housing and rebuilding. For lots of positive reasons, we have a lot of protections on our older housing stock. And we also culturally kind of cherish our Victorian homes, but there are really a lot of good health reasons to scrap that emotional connection that we have. We really struggle not only with cold homes, but also with damp homes, because our properties have not been upgraded in line with the latest expected standards on insulation, on preventing like drafts and so on. And yeah, it's a real issue. Our housing quality is bad and it makes our health bad.
I find it quite wild, actually, that the amount of homes, since I've moved here from Canada, the amount of homes I go to where people say, oh, I don't have insulation in my loft, or I don't have insulation at all in my house. I don't understand a situation where you build a house that doesn't have insulation. It really boggles my mind.
But it does feel it's a bit of a familiar policy gimmick to offer support for people to insulate their homes. And then you hear horror stories of people having weird foam shoved in the space between the walls and all the problems that creates and actually makes their homes damper. So has there ever been any effective recent policy on getting people to make their homes more
Those
livable?
policies are so difficult to execute successfully simply because you are relying on the impetus of an individual private homeowner to insulate and to take those steps. And often there are financial reasons why it doesn't make sense, not only because there are so many rogue traders in that market and they've been incentivized to operate poorly by the government schemes not working very well to eliminate rogue traders. Anyone has access to that funding from government if they say they're doing the job they claim they're doing. But it's not just that, although that does affect behaviour. It's also the fact that it still requires a large investment up front from the homeowner, because of course they do benefit, not only in terms of the quality of their home afterwards if it's done professionally, but also in terms of the value of their home. So it makes sense they should put some funding in themselves. The only problem is we don't have those kind of private funds swilling around in the British economy at the moment. And actually, there hasn't been the impetus to do so for a long time because the impact on house prices hasn't been significant enough. Weirdly enough, having a low rating on, the EPC, which is the measurement of how well insulated and protected your home is, it doesn't actually change the value of a property very much. It doesn't really move it. There are some mortgages that are harder to achieve if you have a low rating. I've actually been through that myself. I tried to offer on a home, but it didn't have EPCC, so the mortgage company I was borrowing from wouldn't offer on it. But other than that, there's very little incentive in the market. And so when so much of our property is in private home ownership, there's little you can do really. And actually that is a big problem for government. They can do something on new builds, they can do something on their social housing stock, they can enforce private landlords now through new legislation forthcoming to make improvements, but they can't make individual owner-occupiers do something. And especially when those owner-occupiers are older, they are much less likely to have the financial wealth to do that, or the kind of feeling of momentum to do it for themselves, and they're the most likely to suffer the ill effects as well of poor housing.
A number of our neighbors are getting heat pumps through Octopus at the moment. And so I reached out to one of my neighbors and I said, I'm interested in this, how much did it cost you? And I was thinking maybe we could save up and get a heat pump. And they're like, oh, it was great. It was like £200. And I said, no, that can't be right. But it's because we live in a new build. So my house is only 9 years old. And so, but we don't have to actually do anything to our house to make it suitable for a heat pump. But then I was reading through the different things that you need to do, and I was thinking this could cost you thousands upon thousands depending on the house. At which point it's like, well, how do people afford that? And it seems like such a sort of this cycle where, if you get it right the first time, then yes, this is all relatively cheap and you can have a heat pump and you can have this and that and the other thing. But if you don't, there's no real incentive, right? I mean...
Also, there have been many examples where actually once you go through that work, the property, so let's say a Victorian property or an Edwardian property, they aren't designed for the heat pump style technology. So of course they have to be retrofitted to manage that. But then it's often found that once you've done that process and you've been through this massive cost, actually it's not saving money on bills either at the other end, because the property is still not designed, the walls aren't designed and so on to actually operate correctly.
And our houses are very close together, so we can't put a heat pump in because our walls are too close to another wall, and we can't, whatever it is, 1.5 meters you're supposed to have.
Yeah, lots of planning restrictions.
Yeah, you can't do that. Has anybody ever sort of costed this from the impact of health and on, the NHS or any governmental health system anywhere, what the implications are for a population that's not got adequate heating in their homes and the knock-on effect on an individual basis or on a population basis?
So one of the main reasons that the government is putting these measures in place, both for social landlords to make sure that they're all meeting EPCC and eventually B, that's expected that legislation will tighten, and also private landlords are now expected to make changes too, is partly because we know that the cost is much more expensive in treating the problems further on than intervening earlier. So that they want to do something to make sure that we're saving money in the long term, and even if it means spending a lot more on social housing right now, which the Labour government is doing, and building to a much higher standard, which of course costs more. Actually, some of the other things that have been brought in, such as the Warms Home discount, for me, that's the only genuinely useful kind of practical intervention in the short term that any government has done. It's a small amount of money, but it works because it's a cash transfer, and actually giving cash up front to help pay those bills and keep homes warmer prevents a huge cost down the line with, frail people living in really, really poor quality housing with extreme damp, which can escalate the pace of many, many, many illnesses in mid and late life. And it also can destroy children's lives. I'm sure we'll talk in a little bit about Awaab's law, which is the law that came in after the death of Awaab Ishak, who died from respiratory failure due to mold exposure in social housing. That just demonstrates the huge cost. I mean, he was treated in hospital tens of times before he eventually tragically died at the age of 2. And his life was wasted because of this. And so intervening early on to treat the problem of cold and damp is much more cost effective.
Like many things that we talk about, health inequalities, the poorer people who have other things which affect their health are the people who are least able to keep their homes warm. So a lot of stuff about winter fuel allowance over the past couple of years, and governments have come and gone on that. It always felt slightly unfair that my dad, who probably won't listen to this podcast, so I can say this, he lives in a very nice house and has plenty of money, and he was getting a winter fuel allowance. It was felt that everybody had to have it, but having it means tested and making sure it's given to the very poorest of our society seems the fairest way to me to use a limited resource. What thinking goes behind a winter fuel payment scheme, and how is that done?
The reason that universality is popular is because it is actually cheaper to administer, essentially. But there is an unfairness there. Why should those who are living in £1 million homes with excellent final salary pensions, of which there are many people who are now in their 70s and 80s are in that situation, why should they get it when there are other people who are really, really struggling and for whom the smaller cash handouts from government are not meeting the difference? Absolutely, I think it's a fair question. I think actually myself that the government was absolutely right to start to means test the allowance, but they handled it in a very poor way politically. They should have set the level slightly higher because we're living in a country at the moment that is really struggling with inflation.
Yeah.
And obviously we're still seeing fuel costs rising, and they should have put in various other tests. Their other motivation also was to try and get more people to claim pension credits. Just a bit of context, if you don't know, the strategy that is now abandoned, initially put forward by the Labour government, was to make sure that anyone claiming pension credit could also get the winter fuel allowance. So connecting the two things. And they did that partly because so many people are entitled to pension credit and don't claim it for lots of reasons. They don't think they're the sort of person that's entitled to benefits. There's some cultural stigma around claiming any kind of benefits at all. And they wanted to break that. And I think that was a laudable idea. But the reality in the way that they actually handled the rollout of this was a disaster for them. So they've ended up now having to kind of roll back on that policy as a result, which is an unfair decision, I think.
So obviously there are new political parties coming to the fore in the UK. I hesitate to use the phrase, but they seem to be policy light or single policy focused. Any idea if reform were to get in the next government, what their feelings are about such things as support for homes?
Reform have very contradictory views on every policy area, and housing and health is not an exception to that. They both focus on the kind of the value of the independent homeowner and the rights to not be taxed and to have reducing property taxes and so on. And yet they also talk about supporting social housing for those people who they deem to be worthy of it, which of course doesn't include immigrant populations. Equally, they talk about boosting both the state pension and also the tax-free allowance up to £20,000, so you could earn £20,000 at any time in your life and not pay tax on it. And yet they say that, and then they still want to deliver an increased pension. No, you can't do those things. So there's an interesting news story this week about social care in Kent County Council. Kent has got a large reform councillor number now, and they've just admitted that they're probably going to have to raise taxes in Kent because they've discovered that when they got in there, and they've said this openly on the record, we thought there would be lots of slack to cut, but it turns out, surprise, surprise, there isn't. And they're grappling with that now. So whether or not within 3 years, when the next general election is due to be held, that message has sort of dissolved the rising tide of reform, I'm not sure. They'll certainly have to grapple with these issues more, what shall I say, more pragmatically if they're going to...
maybe a bit more detail as well.
Yeah.
It's all rather light, isn't it?
I could say so much about this, but Nigel Farage was a one-trick guy over Brexit, which turned out also to be very policy light in terms of how it worked in practice. And
so they have form with this then.
Yeah, they have form.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I wonder how reform seemed to take a very libertarian approach to how they're viewing things. So it's much more individualistic in some ways. And
in some ways, and yet they also want to say the right things to the poorest communities, which sometimes does involve forms of cash transfer like a state pension and so on, and they don't know how to grapple with that intellectually.
Yeah. And so for me, it means when we think about something like how do we support people living in cold homes, I can't yet figure out how they would bring those two bits together, if that makes sense.
Mm.
There is a sense if you own your own home, then you get to be the king of the castle of your own home. So therefore we shouldn't meddle. But then, yes.
But then they also don't want the NHS to continue to exist. So there are lots of ways in which their thinking is fragmenting. Maybe they genuinely think if it's an insurance-based model, if you live in poor quality housing and you don't keep up your home and you suffer the ill effects of damp and mold, well, then that is your lookout in terms of your own insurance premiums. I think this is very naive myself.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, right? Because the three of us in this room know that there's very little control that you can have over something like how damp your home is, even if you're a homeowner, because fixing that problem can be so astronomical in price that you're simply unable to.
And also, when you're buying a property, there's huge evidence that the process that you go through is insufficient in making sure that you know what you're buying. There are so many examples of people discovering a massive issue with damp or with poor construction once they're already living there. And there's very little recourse as well for the surveys that you've had and the support you had from your solicitor. Even a member of the government caught out on this recently. And I think ultimately expecting people to know what faces them, even if they're buying their own property, in terms of its maintenance costs is slightly naive as well. The system doesn't work well enough for homeowners.
And then if you move into private rental, then it's a whole other ballgame, right? I mean, we do have some changes in law happening, but at the same time, a lot of that's largely you're at the mercy of what your landlord's willing to do.
Absolutely.
And so what we end up is situations where people can pay astronomical bills just to try and keep things at a level 15 degrees in their home or to keep mold or damp at bay. And there's really little they can do.
And we've got a very, very large population living in private rent and growing all the time. Obviously, because we've underinvested in social housing for a very long time, we've sold off so much of our social housing stock through the right to buy. One of the interesting things about the last sort of 25, 30 years of housing policy is that while we've underinvested in new social housing, which as being new builds would meet some of these expectations around healthy living, there was, during the 90s and the Blair years and early 2000s, a huge investment in the quality of existing social housing through the Decent Homes Standard. That actually did really well for improving a lot of social housing stock. Not all of it. We know that there's currently a bit of a damp and mold crisis that needs addressing that's been allowed to happen in the last 15 years when there's been less support for social landlords. But there was a massive improvement stage. Meanwhile, though, that proportion of the population who actually access social housing has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And private rent, which has taken, as Margaret Thatcher said when she outlined this policy for increasing the number of private rent, housing benefit has taken the strain off social housing and has basically placed lots of people who should really qualify for subsidised housing in private rent. And private landlords have had absolutely no incentive to do anything until recently. There is now a decent home standard for private rented housing. The new Labour government has brought that in, and it should bring them up to equality with social housing. And also we know that they're making it harder for landlords to evict for basically reporting a problem in their home. So these things give tenants extra protection, which is great. The problem is that we've still got a massive housing crisis, so people are still scared to raise any issue because they just want to be sure that they have somewhere to live. We've also got a situation where this legislation is coming in, and I'm not criticising the government for doing it, it's absolutely the right thing to do, but it's coming in at a time where a lot of private rented housing stock is not inflating in value in the way it used to. Even though rent values are rising, which means that their income for private landlords is rising, the actual value of their asset is not rising in the same way, particularly for flats in cities. And that means that many of them, because of the cost of meeting this decent home standard and the added cost of the support for tenants, which is rightly now being placed, many of them are choosing to leave the market. So the pressure is getting harder and harder on people to find a home at all, which means that they don't complain about this stuff.
That's what I was thinking when you were just talking about that. How many are just simply saying, no, yeah, I'm out. I'm not going to do this, landlord.
Oh, so many. I mean, it's a significant problem. And also some of them have been moving. They've worked out they can get higher yields by working with agents to provide temporary accommodation to local authorities instead, because an agent will pay them to take the rooms for a certain number of nights and then sell that space on to the local authority. And they get higher yields from doing that, and they don't have tenants tied up there for a long time, so they can release, if they want to sell suddenly, they can get their asset back. Which, as a financial model, that makes more sense. I see why landlords are making this choice. They are, after all, businesses. They're not there for, the good of the country. They're there protecting their own financial asset. And we shouldn't be shy about that, because it's a key driver in the state of the nation's health. And it's not actually the job of an individual private landlord to worry about the cost to the NHS in 30 years' time of the child that's living there now. It's their job to provide a functioning home, and the government's tightening up the rules on that, but it's not their job to think about the big picture. That's the government's job. So these landlords are shifting their properties around in ways that make the most money for them, and understandably so, but it's having a massive impact structurally. And while the government is investing an unprecedented amount in social housing over the next 10 to 15 years, if they'll have them in power, it will take 15 to 20 to see the impact of that. So there is a short-term real crunch or bite for the nation's health.
And the housing building programme, is it big enough?
We don't know the full numbers yet. We don't know how much of that's going to social housing. We don't know how much of that is going to the misnomer that is affordable housing, which is in many areas up to 80% of market rent. Now, if you're talking about London, 80% of market rent is out with the capacity of most ordinary earning families. Yeah, but that detail's coming soon. So I regularly cover housing, and I'm sort of crossing my fingers for the people I work with and write for, working in housing associations, that are actually going to get a genuine big investment in social housing.
How much sort of public understanding do you think there is of how important sort of air quality within a home is? And we've talked about mould and the risks therein. I would help with a report by Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health looking at air quality and its impact. And within that report, we put just a tiny sort of one sentence about volatile organic compounds. So sprays and paints and diffusers and candles and things that posh people have. And then went on Good Morning Britain with the lovely Piers Morgan. And that's all he could talk about was, we're saying that we should ban candles in the home. And I cut that, but that's very Piers sort of confrontational to try and get a response. But it does worry me that sort of noise and the impact that many people don't see because they can't see it, they can't feel what their air quality is like in their own home, and they are just trying to get enough warmth, let alone what's happening to the rest of their air quality. How do we get people more aware of this as an important issue in health?
I think that there is a growing understanding, actually, particularly among families. I think the understanding around child lung health is growing. There have been lots of cases talking about outside air pollution, and then obviously we've had Awaab's law around inside, the effects of damp on lung health, and also, broadly cardiovascular health. But I don't think there's the understanding that it's important for everyone. People think of it as about vulnerability, so very young or very old people, and the effect that it has. And of course, disproportionately, you see the immediate impact on those two sectors of the population. But actually, it's harmful for all of us to be living in a damp condition. And I think that there's still a lack of understanding on that. And the problem is, as you say, not only that there's always a kind of, I'm a journalist. If I was writing that report for, say, a major national newspaper that wasn't The Guardian, I would probably have gone for that line too, because most of the readers are going to have those scented candles on their mantelpiece, and it's going to make them read the report. And you'd probably get to the broader detail right on paragraph 12, which nobody gets to. And so I understand the motivation for Morgan there, even though I think it's a shame. It's a missed opportunity to talk about something that affects everyone. This is a big problem with all public health messaging. How do you get beyond what I call the kind of dull but worthy thing? I've spent my entire career writing about dull but worthy issues, and it's not dull to me. And often there's deep tragedy beyond the dull. One story I wrote recently was about the treatment of children in prison during COVID. Now, that is not a dull story. It's an absolute abject moral failure, but it's because it's prison's policy and stuff. It's just so hard to get people interested. And I think this is the same for public health messaging around all of these things. And it does require a big figurehead or a major tragedy to start that conversation. I mean, we didn't really start talking about the quality of social housing until Grenfell, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've been writing about this for 20 years, but nobody cared until Grenfell happened. But then that happened, and then people do care. And it's sad that it feels like we need that to make people listen.
Yeah, and equally, I think everyone's always known about mold and damp, but then it wasn't until a small child dies that we start to see that we have to have more of a conversation about that, and we have to improve policy as well.
And what was interesting about the handling of that in the immediate aftermath as well, that it was, I mean, I won't go rake up the whole story again, but it was quite clear that even the Housing Association didn't realise the severity of the failure, and the handling of the communications around that story was very, very poor initially, and it led to the departure of the chief exec. Not really over the actual tragedy, but over the handling of it and the misunderstanding of how crucial this was as a public health story. And I think that was because of years and years of like, oh, this stuff doesn't really matter in the public mind.
Yeah.
And then it's changed a little bit, but again, I think only around children and the frail. It's not really changed around the general needs population.
It's interesting. So I was talking to someone about sort of health and housing and fuel poverty, and they said, right, who's the villain in this piece? Who do we have to get? And I said, well, unfortunately, I think the villain is government policy. And it's very hard to describe what that means, but it's also hard to go after, if that makes sense. I think people are not as interested or excited, as you said, about a villain that's government policy. They can go after a landlord, they can go after a builder, they can go after that type of thing. They can understand that. They want a person.
Yeah.
And there isn't a person when it comes to health and housing.
No, and actually when more recently with fuel poverty, when that kind of angle has been tried, okay, we try the energy companies, the spiraling costs. The reality is that they can quite honestly say that geopolitics is the enemy, like maybe Putin or something. And then what do you do about that? You can't get Putin. And that story just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and less able to control for a journalist or whoever's talking about it. It feels less and less manageable, when actually there are quite a lot of practical things that can be managed on a local level. And I personally feel that there are reasons for hope with the devolution of power to local government. So we're about to see the biggest devolution project that has been in my lifetime anyway, with huge amounts of money and power going to town and regional mayors. And if that is successful, if that project does actually pan out as it's planned, then there will be a lot of money that can be leveraged in ways that suit those local areas, on projects that suit the local housing stock. And well, when I say a lot, some money. So that's kind of exciting, because every area's need is slightly different, really.
There is a need for that, isn't it? To understand that, I mean, a bit like how we say with patients, right? Every patient in front of you is different, and you have to deal with them in a different way that suits them. to know that we might be able to start having a bit more power to, well, not we, the local authority might have a bit more power to change things to suit them, could provide a solution. But one of the things that I kind of worry about is that the problem is too big. So one of the things that I've been really shocked by moving here to Britain is just how much has been allowed to happen in housing over the last kind of 40 years that just makes no sense to me. So I can completely understand why, if you're living in an Edwardian or a Victorian home, or even earlier, because there's loads of really older homes, beautiful older homes, that you're not going to have central heating, right? It didn't exist, so obviously you're not going to have it. What I don't understand is how we've allowed ourselves to be in a situation that even in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we were building houses that didn't have central heating, for example. It's that part that boggles me, because you can understand why certain eras obviously don't have something that hadn't been invented yet. But what do we do about everything that we allowed to be built when we knew how to heat a home?
That includes a lot of properties that you would describe as sort of luxury as well, higher end. I'm thinking of a flat I used to rent in Manchester when I was in my 20s, which only had storage heaters. And it would have been built it had reasonably good insulation. It wasn't really cold, but it didn't have that most energy efficient thing of a central heating system.
Yeah.
And it would have been built in the 90s. So yeah, exactly as you're describing. And the reason is cost efficiency. It's much cheaper to not put a fully piped system in.
I know, but it just blows my mind. So I mean, this is probably the most Canadian episode of me being Canadian that you're gonna get. But I just cannot imagine. I mean, I guess because I come from somewhere that the winters are just so much colder. But I cannot imagine building a house and thinking, it's cheaper to not put heat in. It just blows my mind that it's even legal, I guess.
You're touching on an interesting issue there, which is around weather and climate change and winters and so on, because we're having a conversation today about cold and damp and heating homes, which is primarily but not exclusively a winter issue. Actually, some properties are very cold all year round and have damp problems all year round, but it peaks in the winter. But actually definitely in the southeast of England, we've got an interesting shifting issue now where we are building some excellent social housing, which is highly insulated and absolutely uninhabitable in the 35-degree summers we're starting to have. It's causing heat stroke, heat exhaustion, unsafe for children and babies, unsafe for elderly people who can't moderate their own temperature in the same way. And so I think you're right, but we haven't actually solved that problem now, because we are still building property which doesn't entirely meet needs and changing needs.
No, and I can completely understand that. So like I said, I live in a new build and it's about 9 years old. And we are really lucky in the sense that we live in a lovely house and we don't have to spend too much on heating. Though it has doubled since everything started in the last couple of years with cost of living and energy prices. But we're also south facing. And we've finally had to actually buy air conditioning unit for our living room, because on those heat wave days, it's like 41 degrees in our house.
Now imagine that, but on the 37th floor with only one window that fractionally opens because of safety requirements around falling from a high building and insulation against fire risk.
You'd be sweltering, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even then, the only reason why we have an air conditioning unit that works is because I can snake the hose out of the cat flap. Innovation at its best. But yeah, no, and I've actually been looking into, right, so if we got solar panels, which are astronomical, by the way, could that power a full air conditioning system for our house, because it just gets so hot? And so there is that flip side, you're right, that we have to be paying attention to just temperature. Actually, how can our houses be more, how can they attain the temperature for the time period that they're in more easily and more affordably? Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things also that I think is quite interesting is that we've been talking about, different modifications that we can make to houses and different policy, but I kind of wanted to bring us back a little bit to talk about social housing for a second, because I do think while there's solutions there, we also know that it's been, I guess, one of the villains, to go back to some of the language that we're using, and that's why we have Awaab's law, because of what's happened. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk us through a little bit how that came to be and what you think the consequences of that are going to be.
Yeah, I think there are two primary drivers of how we ended up in a situation where there is quite a widespread damp and mold crisis in this country in social housing. It's partly to do with the age of property. So a lot of, we're talking about like 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s council housing, which was moved across often to housing association ownership, which has not been sufficiently maintained. And the reason, or indeed knocked down and replaced, because we haven't had sufficient investment in regeneration to do that. And the reason it hasn't been sufficiently maintained, and this is not to let housing associations off the hook for not presenting this to government and saying we are in a crisis situation, but ultimately they have not actually had the funds to be able to do it. Social rents have been capped, and that's right because tenants can't afford to pay more, but then equally there's been no kind of step in from the government, especially over the last 15 and indeed maybe 20 years, the tail end of Labour, the money was trickling away. The other thing is a cultural one, actually. There's been very much and this is changing in a positive way, but there has been very much this idea of the kind of like almost serf and overlord type relationship between social housing providers and the tenant, where tenants were sort of grateful for what they got, and there wasn't a culture of complaining, and also routinely complaints would be ignored, handled poorly. And the last government, I would say one of the positive things they did around housing was encourage a more vocal tenant population who stood up for their rights, who understood their rights as social tenants. And that has changed somewhat, and I think that's a good thing. And it shocked the social housing sector because it was a real change of culture, and they were used to a much more sort of silent population that they were working with. And so I think that we will see more positive change as a result of that, but it does require cash as well. And ultimately, the local housing allowance, which is the amount that the government will pay in housing benefit, is way below the actual market rate, and social rents are capped to a similar-ish level, and the money doesn't add up.
Yeah, so one of the things that worries me, thinking about sort of different parts of the country and how money is raised by local, you talked earlier about sort of devolvement of financial control locally. You look at a place like Birmingham, which has a very high level of social housing and need.
Yeah.
Yet the amount of money that Birmingham can raise through council tax is much smaller than can be raised in Kensington, Chelsea and Westminster, or wherever. Parts of the country which can raise much more through council tax because they've got bigger properties which have a higher value. They don't have the poorer populations that need the money. Can that be solved?
I slightly disagree with the premise in that every area in this country has need. We are no longer in a situation where there were areas of so-called low demand and low need. That's just not the case. And we're sitting in Kensington, which is, of course, where Grenfell Tower was. And so what you see is different choices being made. Yes, a huge amount of money can be raised from private owners in Kensington through council tax. But the choices about how it's spent are, I would say, much less motivated because of the lack of the kind of oversight from these mayors. So London Mayor Sadiq Khan has done a brilliant job in revolutionising the city's attitude to housing, and it's because he's had that oversight for the whole region, and it's stopped places like Kensington and Chelsea being able to hoard cash and not spend it on social housing. It's going to be the same with Birmingham and the Greater Midlands local authorities. What has happened before is that there's been no kind of local oversight about people looking at the entire picture of local need. There've been like individual councillors and individual town hall politicians basically being quite self-interested and only representing their ward, but now there's like oversight. And also there's cash coming with this. So government cash, yes, the population of some areas of Birmingham will never be able to create that wealth through handing in taxes themselves. But the government should be allocating funding based on need to those mayors who then are able to make local choices about how it's spent rather than being constrained by the expectations of the centre. And actually, previously, local authorities weren't allowed to raise any money from their own social housing stock. They're banned from building for a very long time, and that's no longer going to be the case. So having control over their housing revenue account for those that still have retained social housing, it gives huge freedom. So I think it's very complex to unpick in like a relatively short podcast, but actually I think it's genuinely positive, and there aren't the downsides that you raise are there, but they should be corrected by the allocation from the centre.
And we live in a United Kingdom, supposedly. Have any of the devolved nations got it better than any of the others?
Some people say that Scottish housing policy works better, but if you ask a Scottish person, they would say no.
No, okay.
Scotland's tried a lot of things like rent control, which is considered positively Marxist for some reason in England, but that did have very, very mixed results. The reason being that when you have rent control, what that means is that private landlords can't raise the rent more than a certain percentage over a period while the tenant is there. So you can't, just keep inflating it by 20% a year and say, well, get out if you don't like it. This is my new rent. The problem is what happens when you do that in the market that we live in is that between tenancies, because there's no rent cap, the landlord would just ratchet it up way more between tenancies to prevent the loss of not being able to do so within the tenancy period. And as a result, actually, private rents just went up even more. So it was a great experiment. Whether or not rent capping is something you could ask for to help control costs, I don't think that's ever going to fly in either England or Scotland, to be honest.
There's a real drive in Britain to own a home. Or in the UK more generally, own a home. That's sort of the goal. Whereas I find when I'm talking to friends in France, for example, or other parts of Europe, there's less of a drive to own a home. The idea of long-term renting, so finding some place and renting for the whole of your life, as an example, is much more normal to them.
Because they have the architecture in place to do that, by which I mean the policy architecture. So in Germany, in France, elsewhere in Europe, there are well-established property investment models that offer 20-year tenancies or 15, 20-year tenancies. You can choose less if you want, but there's the option to lock yourself in for a really long period of time. And so families with children feel comfortable being in private rent because they know they won't be moved while their children are at school. All of those things. If you're in private rent in the UK and you have young children and you're being moved on every 2 years, can you find another private rent in the catchment for the school that your child's already in? There are so many associated kind of stability issues that come with that. And so that is why there is still this culture in the UK of owning a home, because it comes with that stability that we haven't been able to create in private rent. Actually, over the last 15 years, there have been more attempts at creating build-to-rent type institutional investment models to find that stability. Where they exist, they tend to be very high yield. So they are elite properties, basically. They are not catering to even the middle of the market, certainly not the bottom of the market. And so really, that's why sort of social housing or owning your own is kind of the goal in Britain, because the social housing, you can still gain a lifetime tenancy, even though they're slightly rationed compared to how they were 15, 20 years ago. And also owning your own home, obviously you've got control. So yeah, that private rent is sort of the worst of both worlds at the moment in this country.
So Hannah, congratulations. You've just been appointed as Housing Minister.
Oh God, terrifying.
What are your 3 key policies for the next beginning of the term of a government?
Focusing on health outcomes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that stability is really, really important. So the first thing I do is that every new social home that you build would be allocated on a lifetime tenancy basis with no ability to sell under the right to buy for at least 10 years. So that you're not losing the housing stock. It's good quality. It's going, families, whoever's allocated it, has got some stability in their life. Because one of the biggest problems for mental and physical health is that lack of stability, being able to plan for yourself, to take chances, to try things out, jobs, all of those things. And I just really believe in the value of a lifetime social tenancy, to allow somebody to stay even if their circumstances change and they no longer need it, in inverted commas. It's their home. So that's number one. The second thing I'd do is I would ensure that we look at the EPC rating because I think it's quite a blunt measure that we're using at the moment, and we're using it to chase things like climate change policy, but we're not really looking for all building. This is all new builds, not just social housing. We're not really looking at the heat risk as well as the cold risk. So I'd want to see that reflected, that our building regulations, and they have improved, but I don't think they've quite caught up with the heat side yet.
We need an environmental resilience score.
Yeah, some kind of resilience for the future. And thirdly, I would overhaul our homelessness policy to intervene earlier, which is very, very expensive, but hugely cost saving in every single public health and well-being outcome. So if you have a child growing up in temporary accommodation, which is the emergency provision that a family will be put in if they face homelessness. And by the way, the number one cause of homelessness at the moment is the end of a private rented tenancy. It's not being kicked out by your parents, which used to be one. It's not addiction, loss of home. It's not losing your home because of going into negative equity. It's being kicked out of a private rented tenancy. Okay. And so I would ensure that a lot of money was put into allocating people who are found to be homeless social housing really quickly, especially when they've got children, because the lifetime costs of the health and the education and the outcomes for children growing up in temporary accommodation are woeful, and it's between 1 and 2 in every classroom in this country now. So you save so much money long term, plus you make that family's life better, which should be a basic outcome for policy, I think.
Brilliant.
I like it. So when do we vote? Housing Secretary Hannah.
I'm very good at saying these things, but actually delivering it is a whole other question.
In my experience, politicians come and go quite quickly, so there'll be an opportunity.
Yes, I'm sure.
Thank you, Hannah, for a brilliant episode of Sick Society. Once again, I've learned much, and I hope our audience has too. I think that we forget how important where we live and how we live is to our health. And you've really given me some challenging thoughts about how I should try and support my patients when I see them. I'd like to thank everybody for listening today, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. So it's goodbye from Alexis and myself, and we'll see you next time.
This has been a Haunted Mouse production. Cut that out.